3 surgeons were coerced into operating on one of Mexico's most feared drug lords. When he died on the table, their bodies turned up months later in concrete-filled steel drums. A radiologist was shot at a cartel checkpoint. A young doctor was killed inside his own clinic. These are 10 doctors and medical workers killed by the cartel. Section 1. The surgeons of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Amado Carrillo Fuentes left his small village in Sinaloa when he was around 12 years old, telling people he would not come back until he was rich. He kept that promise in the most extreme way imaginable. By the time he was in his late 30s, the DEA had quietly designated him the most powerful drug trafficker on earth, a man who moved 4 times more cocaine into the United States than any of his competitors, and who had accumulated a personal fortune that investigators put at around $25 billion. He had built that fortune methodically and, for someone of his stature, almost invisibly. Where other cartel bosses threw parties and surrounded themselves with the visible theater of power, Carrillo Fuentes kept himself deliberately obscure. Few photographs of him existed in any official file. He gave no interviews. He made no public appearances that could be traced or pinned down. The Washington Post, writing about him after his death, called him one of Mexico's most mysterious men, someone who lived discreetly, a new breed of kingpin who operated like a businessman. The DEA said roughly the same thing. For years, that invisibility was one of his most powerful tools. His path to controlling the Juarez cartel had been built on patience and an operational intelligence that most of his rivals simply could not match. Growing up under the influence of his uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, one of the founding figures of the old Guadalajara cartel, Amado had been introduced to the structure and logic of large-scale trafficking from childhood. He worked his way through the organization over years, learning the border routes, building relationships with Colombian suppliers, and understanding which officials could be bought and which ones needed to be handled differently. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured in the late 1980s, following the arrest of its leader, Amado aligned himself with a man named Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, who controlled the Juarez smuggling corridor running along the border with El Paso, Texas. In the early 1990s, Amado had Aguilar Guajardo killed and took full control of the Juarez operation himself. What separated Carrillo from every trafficker before him was the air fleet. He moved cocaine by plane, using a collection of Boeing 727 jets that he had acquired and modified, stripping out the passenger seats and turning the cabins into cargo holds capable of carrying up to 15 metric tons of cocaine per flight. By some estimates, he eventually owned more than 30 of these aircraft, each one flying from Colombian airstrips to remote desert landing zones in northern Mexico, where ground crews would offload the cargo and push it toward the border. The nickname, the Lord of the Skies, came directly from this fleet. Through the first half of the 1990s, the cartel he ran from Juarez generated tens of millions of dollars weekly, most of it flowing through a city that sat directly across the border from El Paso and controlled one of the busiest land ports of entry in the world. He filled the pockets of Mexican officials at every level, maintaining a layer of protection that made moving against him politically dangerous for anyone who tried. By the middle of 1997, the walls he had so carefully maintained were beginning to crack. The political cover he relied on in the state of Morelos collapsed when the governor there, Jorge Carrillo Olea, who shared his surname and had long been accused of shielding him, was forced to resign under sustained public pressure and subsequently arrested. Silent protest marches had been held in Morelos, specifically targeting the governor's relationship with the cartel. Carrillo Fuentes had owned a house 3 blocks from the governor's official residence and had been known to hold large gatherings in the area. With that layer of protection stripped away, and with both Mexican and American authorities tightening their focus, the calculus of staying in Mexico unchanged had fundamentally shifted. The decision he made in response was one of the stranger chapters in the entire history of organized crime. Amado Carrillo Fuentes decided to change his face. The plan was a full facial restructuring combined with extensive liposuction, a procedure intensive enough to require many hours in an operating room, but one that, if successful, would produce a man who could move through the world without being recognized as the Lord of the Skies. He would effectively become someone else. The plan required surgeons willing to perform the work and a facility where it could happen quietly. On July 3, 1997, a man checked into the Santa Monica Hospital in the Polanco neighborhood of Mexico City under the name Antonio Flores Montes. Polanco is one of the most affluent districts in the capital, the kind of area where private clinics serve clients who value discretion above all else. Sources who later spoke to journalists made clear that the staff at the hospital who mattered understood exactly who Antonio Flores Montes actually was. 3 surgeons were brought in for the procedure. Dr. Ricardo Reyes was a Colombian-born plastic surgeon, described at the time as prestigious and well-regarded in his field. Dr. Jaime Godoy Singh was a 37-year-old ear, nose, and throat specialist from Sinaloa, the same state where Carrillo had grown up. Dr. Carlos Avila assisted in the operating room. 2 of Carrillo's bodyguards were present inside the operating room for the entire duration of the surgery, a detail that makes it worth pausing on exactly how much genuine choice any of these 3 men had. Sources later indicated that both Reyes and Godoy Singh had admitted they had been threatened into agreeing. Godoy Singh reportedly told people he had never met Carrillo before and never wanted to be in that operating room. Reyes reportedly said he had understood throughout the entire process that it could cost him his life. These were not men who had walked in willingly out of loyalty to the cartel or admiration for its boss. They were men who had been told what to do by people who were not accustomed to hearing the word no. The surgery lasted approximately 8.5 hours. It proceeded without any immediately obvious complication. When it was finished, Carrillo was moved to a recovery room and left to rest. Nurses checked on him during the evening, and he appeared stable. But early the following morning, a doctor doing rounds found him dead in his bed. The cause, as established through autopsy, involved the combination of a hypnotic sedative called dormicum mixed into the anesthetic administered during the procedure. That combination suppressed his respiratory function in a way his body could not survive, ultimately causing the cardiac arrest that killed him. Whether this was a genuine accident born from the medical complexity of such a long procedure, or whether someone in that room had deliberately introduced the dormicum to ensure the Lord of the Skies did not wake up, was never established with certainty. Speculation spread through the criminal underworld almost immediately, including rumors that a rival organization with a grievance against Carrillo had paid one of the surgeons to make sure the procedure had only one possible outcome. None of that was ever confirmed. What was confirmed was that one of the most powerful men in the world had died in a recovery room, and the people who held themselves responsible for his safety were now looking for someone to blame. Mexican authorities confirmed Carrillo's identity through fingerprints. The DEA backed up the announcement publicly. Officials arranged for the body to be displayed at the Federal Judicial Police morgue to try to settle the wave of conspiracy theories that erupted almost immediately. Photographs of the corpse were released to the press. Some people still refused to believe it. A cousin of Carrillo's told reporters after the funeral that Amado was fine and alive, that the surgery had been performed on another man to deceive the authorities. A barber who saw the photograph in a newspaper told a journalist from the Los Angeles Times that the hands visible in the image were the hands of a classical pianist, that they could not belong to the man he knew. The DEA dismissed the rumors, but they persisted. What happened in the weeks and months that followed was not a rumor at all. The 3 surgeons vanished, not in any dramatic single event, but quietly, the way people disappear when they understand that remaining visible is the most dangerous thing they can do. Godoy Singh's family filed a missing persons report 19 days before his body was found. His relatives told police they did not even know what address he had been living at in Mexico City in the months since the surgery, a gap in basic family knowledge that suggests he had been keeping his movements deliberately hidden since July. They knew only that before his disappearance he had been seen in the company of two men he referred to as Jorge and Ricardo. The family searched for him for nearly 3 weeks in silence. Then the drums appeared on the highway. On a Sunday in November of 1997, on the road between Mexico City and Acapulco, near the town of Iguala in the state of Guerrero, a foul smell drew investigators to 3 sealed steel drums that had been left by the roadside. The smell was detectable even through the sealed lids. When authorities opened the containers, they found 3 bodies inside. Each one was handcuffed. Each one was blindfolded. Each one had been strangled, the cables still wrapped around their necks at the time of discovery. Each one had been burned, and each one had been partially encased in cement that had been poured in after death, making the drums heavy and difficult to simply discard, and ensuring that whoever did this had taken deliberate time with it. The drums were transported to the Forensic Medical Service in Iguala. The state medical examiner oversaw the identification process. Godoy Singh's father and his brother Roberto came to the morgue to see the bodies. His father became ill when shown photographs and had to leave before the process was completed. Roberto stayed. He identified one of the bodies as his brother through a plastic jaw prosthesis and specific dental fixtures distinctive enough to remain identifiable given the condition of the remains. The other 2 bodies in the drums were identified as Dr. Carlos Avila and Dr. Ricardo Reyes. A 4th drum was found in the same area, containing a body so badly damaged it could not be positively identified. Authorities believed it may have been a 3rd assistant connected to the surgery. That body was never matched to a name in any public record. The Guerrero State Judicial Police, when asked directly whether the killings were connected to drug trafficking, gave an answer that was careful but clear. Everything appeared to indicate they were. When news of the drums reached the public, it landed with a particular kind of heaviness. Reporting at the time noted that when the Lord of the Skies died in his recovery room back in July, many Mexicans had immediately and grimly wondered how long it would take before one of the surgeons turned up dead. The answer, as one piece of contemporary journalism put it, was 4 months. The cartel had not moved quickly or impulsively. It had waited, allowed the initial attention to settle, let the doctors believe they might escape whatever was coming, and then moved. The patience of it was in some ways more unsettling than if it had happened immediately. Mexican authorities had briefly filed murder charges against the surgeons in the immediate aftermath of Carrillo's death, with the head of the country's anti-drug agency stating publicly that the physicians had applied a combination of medicines with the intention of causing the trafficker's death. Those charges did not result in any trial. They were eventually dropped, partly because the evidence was insufficient, and partly because by November, 2 of the 3 accused men were already dead and sealed inside steel on a highway south of the capital. No one was ever charged in Mexico for the killings of Godoy Singh, Avila, and Reyes. No suspect was ever publicly named. No arrest was ever made. The Juarez cartel, in the months after Amado's death, was fracturing rapidly, with his brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes fighting to consolidate control, while rival organizations moved against the territory the Lord of the Skies had held. In that environment, 3 murders on a highway became simply part of the general accounting of a cartel in chaos. 1 doctor survived the aftermath. A man identified in Washington Post, reporting as Pedro Rincon, described as having played an assisting role connected to the surgery, grew sufficiently frightened in the weeks following the discovery of the drums that he turned himself in to Mexican police and asked for protection. The Mexican government, eager to avoid further international attention on a case that was already generating diplomatic friction, quietly arranged to remove Rincon and his family from the country. They were transported to the United States aboard a government jet in late 1997 and handed over to American intelligence agencies for safeguarding. Rincon disappeared into a new life in the United States, protected by people whose interest in his continued existence had as much to do with what he might know as with any concern for his safety. A fifth individual, believed to have been connected to the surgery, simply vanished and was never publicly accounted for at all. What this case establishes, at its core, is a pattern that would play out across Mexican medicine for the following 3 decades in one form or another. These men had not chosen to treat a cartel boss out of sympathy or loyalty to his organization. At least 2 of them, by their own reported admissions, had been threatened into the operating room. Bodyguards had stood over them the entire time. Refusing had never been a realistic option for any of them. They had done what was demanded of them. The patient had died anyway, from a surgical complication that was either catastrophically accidental or deliberately arranged by someone whose identity was never established. And then the cartel had held the men who had been forced into the room responsible for what happened inside it. There was no distinction drawn between voluntary and involuntary. There was no recognition of the fact that a doctor told by armed men that he will operate or face the consequences is not, in any meaningful sense, choosing to be there. The only thing the Juarez cartel appeared to consider relevant was that 3 doctors had stood over Amado Carrillo Fuentes, and that he was now dead, and someone needed to answer for that. The drums on the Acapulco highway were the answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the surgeons of Amado Carrillo paid with their lives for a patient's death they did not cause, the next case on this list involves a doctor who never touched a cartel member at all. She was killed simply for driving through the wrong stretch of road at the wrong moment, in a state where armed men had decided that stopping at their checkpoints was not a request. Section 2. Dr. Maria Esther Talamantes Bañuelos. The state of Zacatecas sits in the north-central part of Mexico, connected by highways to 8 neighboring states and positioned along some of the most strategically valuable drug corridors on the continent. For most of its modern history, Zacatecas was better known for silver mining than for organized crime. That changed over the years that followed Mexico's military-led offensive against cartels beginning in 2006, and by the early part of the next decade, it had become a genuine battleground. By 2021, the state held the distinction of having the highest homicide rate per 100,000 inhabitants of any state in the country, a number that reflected years of escalating fighting between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel for control of the transit routes, marijuana and poppy cultivation zones, and population centers that Zacatecas offered to whichever organization could hold it. The municipalities at the center of the worst violence were clustered in the western part of the state. Fresnillo, a mid-sized city known as the world's largest silver producer, had been described by a national statistics agency as the most terrified city in Mexico, with more than 96% of its population reporting that they lived in fear. Jerez, a smaller city to the southwest, had seen a 7-day stretch earlier in 2021 involving continuous shootouts, grenade attacks, and burning vehicles, forcing a near statewide security response. Valparaíso, a municipality further west, sat at a point where highway routes connected Pacific ports to the northern border, making it genuinely valuable to any organization trying to move product north. On June 25th of that same year, a battle between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco Cartel in the town of San Juan Capistrano, in the municipality of Valparaíso, lasted more than 5 hours and left 18 bodies scattered across roads and hillsides. Residents who called the authorities for help were told that the terrain made it impossible to reach them. When security forces finally arrived the following morning, the fighting was over, and the only things left were the dead. In this environment, cartel checkpoints had become a feature of daily life on rural highways in the region. Armed men, dressed in civilian clothes, would station themselves along state roads with no warning, stopping vehicles and demanding identification, or simply deciding for themselves whether the people inside were connected to a rival organization, were informants, were useful to hold, or were simply too much of an unknown to let pass. Sometimes the checkpoints had a stated logic. Sometimes they appeared to exist for no purpose other than to demonstrate that the cartel controlled the road. Either way, stopping was not really a choice. It was a demand backed by weapons, and the people who lived and worked in that part of Zacatecas knew it. Many adapted their routines entirely, avoiding certain roads at certain times, calling ahead to contacts who might know whether a stretch of highway was active that day. Some did not have that option. Their jobs required them to be on those roads, regardless of what was happening around them. Dr. Maria Esther Talamantes Bañuelos was a radiologist working for the Mexican Social Security Institute, the IMSS. Her assignment took her to the municipality of Valparaíso, which meant that reaching her workplace required driving the state road that cuts between Jerez and Valparaíso through the Sierra de Jerez, a stretch of mountainous terrain that was, by the summer of 2021, one of the most dangerous roads in a state that was full of dangerous roads. The Sierra offered no cell phone signal along significant portions of the route. There were no police patrols in that stretch in any meaningful or consistent way. What there was, on the morning of July 8, 2021, was a cartel checkpoint manned by armed men in civilian clothes, positioned across the road at a point between the communities of Mesa de Carrillo and Villahermosa. Talamantes was traveling with a companion, a man whose identity was concealed by authorities for his own safety in the days after the incident. The two of them were heading from Jerez toward Valparaíso, where she worked. When they came upon the checkpoint, they could see what it was. Armed civilians, not police, not military, not anyone with any legal authority to stop traffic, standing in the road with weapons visible. The decision made in that moment was the kind that people in cartel-controlled areas of Mexico are forced to make regularly, often in a fraction of a second: stop and submit to whatever those men want, or accelerate and try to pass through before they can react. Talamantes accelerated. She drove her red vehicle through the checkpoint without stopping. The men at the checkpoint opened fire. A bullet entered through the driver's side door and struck Talamantes in the right thigh. The wound hit the femoral region of her leg, a location where blood loss can become catastrophic within minutes if there is no immediate intervention. Already injured, she lost control of the vehicle. The car left the road and rolled over, coming to rest upside down off the highway near the community of Villahermosa. Her companion survived the crash and was himself wounded by gunfire. He climbed out of the overturned vehicle and hid in the brush beside the road, staying out of sight while the men from the checkpoint were still in the area. He was afraid, entirely reasonably, that if the gunmen came to investigate what had happened to the car they had shot at and found survivors, those survivors would not remain survivors for long. There was no cell phone signal in that part of the Sierra. The crash happened in the morning, but the report of what had occurred did not reach anyone with the ability to respond until the afternoon. When paramedics finally arrived at the overturned vehicle on the roadside, Dr. Maria Esther Talamantes Bañuelos was already dead. She had bled out from the gunshot wound to her leg, alone in or near the wreck of her car, in a stretch of mountains where no signal could reach anyone and no help could come fast enough. The forensic examination later confirmed the cause of death as a penetrating gunshot wound to the right thigh from a firearm projectile. The hole the investigators found in the driver's side door panel of her car told the rest of the story in physical terms. At first, the official account of the incident described only a traffic accident. A woman had lost control of her vehicle, the car had overturned, and she had died. That version did not hold for long. Forensic examiners from the state prosecutor's office discovered the bullet hole in the door panel and the gunshot wound on the body, and the account changed. The state security spokesperson eventually confirmed what the physical evidence showed. The companion who had hidden in the brush while wounded came forward and cooperated with investigators, telling them about the checkpoint, about the armed civilians, about Talamantes accelerating rather than stopping, and about the shots that followed. His account was the clearest, direct witness testimony available, and authorities noted his identity would not be made public given the obvious risks that disclosure would carry. The killing of Dr. Talamantes landed inside a 10-day span of violence against medical workers in Zacatecas that made it impossible to view her death as an isolated incident. 9 days before she was shot on that mountain road, on the night of June 29th and into the early hours of June 30th, a 24-year-old medical intern named Luis Fernando Montes de Oca Armas and the driver of his ambulance had been killed after completing a patient transfer and attempting to return home through Valparaíso. That case is covered separately in this list, but its proximity to Talamantes' death in both time and geography matters for understanding what the state of Zacatecas had become by that summer. 2 medical workers had been killed on the road between Jalisco and Valparaíso, less than 2 weeks apart. Both had been killed by armed groups operating openly on state highways. Both had done nothing except be on those roads as part of their jobs. The medical community in Zacatecas responded to both deaths together, staging what was described as a march for peace, demanding an end to the violence targeting health workers in the state. The practical consequences of what was happening to medical personnel in that region of Zacatecas extended well beyond the individual deaths. 4 rural health clinics in the mountainous areas of the state announced temporary closures in the days following Talamantes' killing, with health workers citing the impossibility of safely reaching or staffing facilities in cartel-controlled terrain. Medical students and interns who had been assigned to social service placements in the area began refusing their postings or requesting transfers to municipalities where the risk of being shot on the road to work was not simply a fact of daily life. The mayor of Valparaíso acknowledged publicly in the months that followed that clinics in his municipality continued to operate without full staffing because medical professionals did not want to come to the area, and that some rural health centers remained closed entirely as a direct result of the violence that had been directed at health workers that summer. No arrest was ever made publicly for the killing of Maria Esther Talamantes Bañuelos. No suspect was named, no group claimed responsibility, and no organization was officially charged with ordering or carrying out the shooting. The men at the checkpoint remained unidentified. The companion who survived and gave his account to investigators did so under the protection of anonymity, and there is no public record of what, if anything, came of his testimony in terms of an actual prosecution. The Guerrero state authorities had said about the Carrillo surgeons 24 years earlier that everything appeared to indicate their deaths were connected to drug trafficking, and the Zacatecas authorities said something broadly similar about Talamantes, but neither set of words ever translated into an arrest or a trial. The checkpoint where she was shot was on a road that cartel-connected groups had been using as a control point for months. The men who fired at her vehicle were not police. They had no legal authority to stop anyone on that road. And yet the system that exists to hold people accountable for killing a doctor on her way to work in a state hospital produced nothing that was ever made public. What Talamantes' case shows, stripped of all the surrounding context about cartel territory and highway violence, is something very simple. She was a doctor. She was driving to her hospital. She encountered armed men blocking the road who had no legal right to be there. She chose not to stop for them. They shot her, and she died on the roadside alone because there was no cell signal and no one could reach her in time. The cartel checkpoint that killed her existed because the state had, in that stretch of mountain road, effectively ceded control of who moved and who stopped and who lived to pass to armed groups that answered to no government and no law. That session, replicated across dozens of roads in that part of Zacatecas and beyond, turned the simple act of driving to work into a decision that could end a life. For Maria Esther Talamantes, it did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Dr. Talamantes was shot on an open road simply for refusing to stop, the next case on this list involves a young doctor and an ambulance driver who had already done everything right. They had driven through cartel territory, delivered their patients safely, and were on their way home when the men who controlled that highway decided they were not going to make it. Section 3. Dr. Luis Fernando Montes de Oca Armas and Octavio Romero Diaz. Becoming a licensed doctor in Mexico takes roughly 7 years. The final stretch of those 7 years includes a 12-month period called the Servicio Social, a mandatory program of community service that has existed in Mexican medical education since 1936. Under the program, students who have completed all their academic coursework and clinical rotations must spend a year working in public health facilities, often rural ones, before they can receive their degree and pursue a residency or specialization. The program was designed with a dual purpose: to give graduating medical students real-world clinical experience and to bring medical care to communities in remote or underserved parts of the country that struggle to attract established doctors. It has, over the decades, created a quiet and largely invisible system in which the government's rural health infrastructure is staffed significantly by people who are technically still students, paid at a fraction of what a licensed physician earns, working shifts that in some cases stretch to 36 or even 40 hours, and assigned to areas with no supervision, no security, and in the 21st century, active cartel presence along the only roads, in or out. By 2021, medical associations and student groups in Mexico had been raising alarms about the safety of Servicio Social placements for years. Between 2007 and 2015, 7 medical interns had been killed while performing their social service, according to data from the Ministry of Health at the time. Organizations that tracked the issue independently believed the real number was higher, since many incidents went unreported or were not officially connected to the intern's role as a medical worker. Around 6,000 of the roughly 34,000 students doing social service in 2021 were placed in remote rural communities, far from state capitals, often in areas where cartel violence had made the roads dangerous and the buildings unguarded. In data collected from students in Zacatecas alone for the 2020 to 2021 academic cycle, a meaningful proportion of interns reported experiencing some form of threat or aggression during their placements. The hashtag that would emerge in response to what happened in Valparaiso in the summer of 2021, pleading for justice and safety, did not come from nowhere. It came from students who had been trying to make this point for a long time. Luis Fernando Montes de Oca Armas was 24 years old and about 1 month away from finishing his Servicio Social when he was killed. He was a student at the Autonomous University of Guadalajara, one of the most respected private medical schools in the country, and he had been assigned to a hospital in the municipality of Huexuquilla El Alto, in the northeastern tip of the state of Jalisco, a community that sits right up against the border with Zacatecas. Huexuquilla El Alto is small and remote, surrounded by sierra terrain, and the hospital, where Luis Fernando worked, was the primary medical facility for a wide area of small communities on both sides of the Jalisco-Zacatecas border. A month out from finishing, he had done the work, survived the long shifts, and was nearly through. One more month, and he would have had his degree. Octavio Romero Diaz was the driver of the ambulance that belonged to the Jalisco Health Secretariat and was stationed at the Huejuquilla El Alto Hospital. In a region with limited medical resources, ambulance drivers are not background personnel. They are the link between isolated communities and the hospitals that might be able to save someone's life. And the routes they drive are often the same routes that armed groups control, check, and treat as their own private territory. Romero knew the roads. He drove them regularly as part of his job. On the night of Wednesday, June 30th, 2021, Luis Fernando and Octavio were transporting a patient from Huejuquilla El Alto to Fresnillo, the larger city in central Zacatecas, about 2 hours to the east. The exact nature of the patient has been reported differently across sources. Some accounts describe the patient as a pregnant woman in need of obstetric care that the smaller hospital was not equipped to provide. Other early reporting suggested the patient may have been a wounded man connected to criminal activity in the area. The version that gained the most traction in official statements and the reporting that followed described a pregnant woman with complications, which is consistent with the kind of transfer a rural hospital would routinely request for a case beyond its capacity. What is not disputed is that Luis Fernando and Octavio successfully completed the transfer, delivered whoever the patient was to a hospital in Fresnillo, and then turned the ambulance around and headed back toward Huejuquilla El Alto through the night. The hospital staff expected the ambulance to return by 8 in the evening. That deadline came and went. The staff waited, then began trying to reach them. There was no response. By the time anyone was able to organize a proper search, it was close to 11:30 at night when public security personnel from the municipality of Valparaiso located the ambulance in a community called La Florida, within Valparaiso's territory. The ambulance was abandoned by the roadside. The engine was still running and the lights were still on, a detail that paints the clearest possible picture of how suddenly whatever happened to those two men had ended. When officers approached the vehicle and searched the surrounding area, they found the bodies of Luis Fernando Montes de Oca Armas and Octavio Romero Diaz nearby, in the grass and dirt beside the road. Both men had been shot multiple times in different parts of their bodies. At some point after the attack, the ambulance was set on fire. Firefighters later extinguished the blaze. The Valparaiso municipality where they were found was, at that moment, one of the most violently contested stretches of territory in the entire country. 5 days before Luis Fernando and Octavio were killed, on June 25th, a battle between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel in the community of San Juan Capistrano, within the same municipality, had lasted more than 5 hours through the night and left 18 bodies scattered across roads and hillsides. That confrontation had happened because Valparaiso sat at a highway junction connecting the Pacific coast to the northern border, making it a prize that both organizations were willing to kill for, and kill for consistently. The municipal government had acknowledged the violence. State security officials had acknowledged the violence. There were on-record statements from Valparaiso's mayor describing the situation as fire crossed from all directions. And into this specific geography, in this specific month, the Jalisco Health Secretariat had been sending its ambulance along a return route that passed directly through a zone where 18 people had just been killed in a single night. Whether the cartel checkpoint that intercepted Luis Fernando and Octavio was connected to any specific intelligence about who was in that ambulance, or whether the vehicle was simply stopped because anything moving on that road at night was subject to being stopped, is not known with any certainty. Some reporting raised the possibility that the ambulance had earlier transported a patient connected to one of the armed groups, and that men associated with a rival organization had followed or flagged the return trip as a result. That theory was never confirmed. Another detail that circulated in reports, that the men had been stopped at an earlier checkpoint on the way to Fresnillo, where they were forced to identify themselves before being allowed through, was referenced in the Borderland beat account of the case, suggesting the ambulance and its occupants may have been on someone's radar even before the attack on the return journey. This too was not confirmed in official statements. What is confirmed is what the Jalisco governor said the morning after the bodies were found. Enrique Alfaro Ramirez issued a public statement condemning the killings in the strongest terms, describing the deaths as completely unacceptable and demanding that Zacatecas state authorities produce a full explanation and pursue the perpetrators. He pledged full cooperation from Jalisco's own prosecutors. The Jalisco Health Secretariat issued its own statement, calling the killings an attack on people who had been doing nothing more than their jobs, and conveying condolences to the families. The Autonomous University of Guadalajara published a message on its social media accounts, expressing profound grief over the death of its student, acknowledging the violence that had claimed him, and asking authorities to intervene and stop what was happening to medical workers in the country. The medical community's response was broader and louder than any individual institution. The hashtag Justice for Luis spread across Mexican social media within hours of the news breaking, with doctors, students, nurses, and the general public sharing photographs of Luis Fernando alongside demands for accountability. The phrase became a rallying point for something much larger than one killing, because anyone involved in medical education in Mexico understood immediately that what happened to Luis Fernando was not an aberration. It was the most extreme version of a risk that tens of thousands of young doctors in training faced every year. The consequence of a system that had been filling rural health posts with unsupervised students since 1936 and had never seriously grappled with what happened when the communities those students were sent to became active war zones. Social media posts from colleagues compared medicine to the only career in the country where training requires you to work 36-hour shifts without being classified as a worker, where completing your degree requires spending a year in a place that sometimes the National Guard will not even enter. One physician writing online put it plainly: "We are being sent as sacrifices." The anger that followed Luis Fernando's death did not produce the kind of systemic reform his supporters had been demanding. The Zacatecas State Attorney General's office opened an investigation. The Jalisco government pressed for answers. Neither the investigation nor the pressure produced an arrest or a public identification of the men who stopped that ambulance in La Florida and shot the two people inside it. The ambulance itself was destroyed. No suspect was ever named. No cartel or subgroup claimed responsibility. The roads through Valparaiso remained contested and dangerous in the months that followed, and the social service placements in the most dangerous municipalities continued, with some temporary withdrawals following the spike in media attention before gradually returning to the prior pattern as the coverage faded. Luis Fernando Montes de Oca Armas had 1 month left. He had done the hard part of becoming a doctor, survived the long shifts, driven the difficult roads, and was on his way back from doing exactly what the program asked him to do. He and Octavio Romero were bringing an empty ambulance home through the night. They were not carrying drugs. They were not connected to any cartel. They were on that road because their hospital was on that road, and their job required them to be on it. The men who stopped them and killed them appear to have made a decision about the ambulance and the people inside it that night, and no authority has ever been able to establish publicly who those men were, which organization they belonged to, or what conclusion they reached that made it seem necessary to open fire on a medical vehicle in Zacatecas with its lights still on and its engine still running. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Luis Fernando and Octavio were killed on a highway that cartels had turned into their own private checkpoint system, the next case on this list moves from open roads to something more intimate and more devastating. A young anesthesiologist killed inside her own home in the small hours of the morning, 4 hours before she had planned to leave to watch her 5-year-old daughter give a speech at kindergarten graduation. Section 4. Dr. Maciel Mexia Medina. The Sierra Tarahumara is one of the more remote and physically dramatic landscapes in all of Mexico. It covers a broad stretch of the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range in the western part of the state of Chihuahua, a terrain of deep canyons, dense pine forest, and altitudes that push above 2,000 meters in places. The Raramuri people, sometimes called the Tarahumara, have lived in and around these mountains for centuries, and the region's relative isolation from the rest of the country has historically been both a point of cultural preservation and a practical problem for the delivery of basic government services. Roads into the Sierra are narrow, often unpaved, and in some seasons impassable. Cell phone coverage along significant stretches of the main routes is absent or unreliable. Getting from the mountain communities to the nearest city of Chihuahua can take 3 hours or more, depending on the road and the weather. It is also cartel territory. The Sierra Tarahumara sits at the northern edge of what investigators and journalists often call the Golden Triangle, the vast region where the states of Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and Durango converge, long one of the most productive marijuana and opium poppy cultivation zones in the hemisphere. The Sinaloa cartel has maintained a presence in the Sierra for decades, using its remote terrain and sparse law enforcement coverage as natural cover for cultivation and production. The Juarez cartel, operating through its enforcement arm La Línea, competes for those same routes and territories, particularly in the municipalities that connect the Sierra to the northern border. By the early 2020s, the Bocoina municipality, which includes the community of San Juanito, had been specifically identified by Chihuahua state authorities as an area where organized crime groups tied to both cartels were actively fighting for control, engaging in homicides, kidnappings, and armed attacks against both rivals and civilians. State investigators had noted La Línea maintaining an armed presence in Bocoina territory specifically to block Sinaloa cartel incursions. Illegal logging operations in the same area, worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, had become an additional revenue source that both organizations were fighting to control, leading to additional violence against community members and indigenous landowners who resisted cartel encroachment on communal forest lands. San Juanito is a small town in Bocoina, roughly 20 kilometers from the municipal seat, high in the Sierra and surrounded by sawmills, some of them reportedly linked to La Línea. It is the kind of community where a single rural hospital serves an enormous area of spread-out smaller settlements, where the nearest backup medical facility requires a significant journey, and where the health workers assigned there operate largely without security support. According to reporting by the newspaper Milenio in the days after the killing, there were no municipal or state police and no Army or National Guard personnel who could reach San Juanito in under an hour if something went wrong. When something went wrong on the morning of July 11th, 2022, the hospital staff had no meaningful way to call for immediate help. Maciel Mexia Medina was 38 years old, originally from Guasave, in the northwestern part of Sinaloa, the state that borders Chihuahua to the west. She had qualified as an anesthesiologist approximately 16 months before her death, a specialty that requires additional years of training beyond general medical certification, and she had been working at the IMSS Bienestar Hospital in San Juanito for around 2 years. She had bought a house in the community just 5 months before she was killed. The purchase of a home, rather than simply renting, suggested she was thinking about staying, building something more permanent there, making the mountain community part of her life rather than just a posting to be survived before moving somewhere easier. Her daughter, Antonella, was 5 years old. She was getting ready to attend kindergarten graduation. The mayor of San Juanito, who had known Mexia through their shared connection to medicine, later told journalists that she had been planning to travel back to Sinaloa specifically to be at the graduation, where her daughter had been selected to give a message on behalf of her graduating class. That trip was a few days away when a man with an AK-47 walked through her neighborhood in the early hours of a Monday morning. What the Chihuahua State Prosecutor's Office pieced together in the hours and days after the attack was the following. Sometime around 5 in the morning on July 11th, a young man who lived in San Juanito began making his way through the Barrio La Pista neighborhood in an apparent state of intoxication, firing his weapon into the air and entering homes. He broke into at least 2 houses. In one of them, or in the area around it, he sexually assaulted a woman. He was armed with an AK-47 rifle, the weapon typically associated with cartel-linked violence throughout Mexico and commonly known in local slang as the cuerno de chivo, or goat's horn, for the shape of its ammunition magazine. Some reporting described him as a local resident, others as a sicario, a hired gunman, though the two descriptions are not mutually exclusive in a community where cartel recruitment from the local population was a documented feature of life in Bocoina. Whether his attack on Mexia's home that morning was connected to his role within any cartel structure, or whether it was the act of an armed, intoxicated local man whose access to military-grade weaponry was a product of the cartel environment around him, was never established publicly with any certainty. What is established is what happened inside Maciel Mexia's home. The man broke in. She was shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head. She was still alive, at least partially, when the emergency call came in at 5:45 in the morning from security personnel at the IMSS hospital in San Juanito, reporting a woman injured by gunfire. When authorities arrived and found Mexia in the urgency area of the hospital, she showed no vital signs. She died there, in the same hospital where she worked, killed by wounds sustained in her own home in the hours before the start of what was supposed to be an ordinary working day. The state prosecutor's office confirmed the cause of death as gunshot wounds to the head and chest. In the aftermath of the shooting, the people of San Juanito did not wait for the authorities to locate the man responsible. Word spread through the community rapidly about who had done it, and by the time prosecutors had publicly confirmed that a suspect had been identified and that efforts were underway to find him, residents had already done it themselves. The suspect, identified as Juan Alberto, 18 or 19 years old depending on the source, was found later that same day, tied to a utility pole on the outskirts of town, badly beaten, barely conscious. An AK-47 was left on the ground beside him. Next to the pole, whoever had found and punished him had also placed a cardboard sign written in a simple hand, which read in Spanish, "This happened to you for killing the doctor and raping a woman." The community's response to the killing of their anesthesiologist was, in practical terms, faster and more decisive than anything the formal justice system had managed before that day ended. The state prosecutor's office confirmed the detention of the suspect after he received medical attention, and a judge later ordered him to stand trial for the murder. That formal proceeding, moving through the courts over the months that followed, represented the official response to what had happened. The community's sign on the pole represented something else, the accumulated exhaustion of people living in a place where formal justice arrived slowly and unreliably, and where the only real protection anyone had was the knowledge that the community itself might hold you to account. The impact of Mexia's death on the already fragile health infrastructure of San Juanito and the surrounding Sierra was immediate and measurable. The hospital where she had worked was, before the killing, already understaffed and facing institutional difficulties. After her death, it was left with only 2 anesthesiologists on staff, an impossibly thin margin for a facility covering such a large and isolated population. A residency program at the same hospital was scheduled to end later that month, meaning additional medical staff would be departing. The Autonomous University of Chihuahua issued a warning to its medical faculty that it would not be sending any more interns to the Sierra region, citing the obvious impossibility of guaranteeing their safety. Colleagues and hospital staff told Milenio they now lived in fear, not in an abstract or general sense, but in the specific sense of people who had watched their co-worker get shot in her home and did not know when or whether they themselves were next. The hospital posted a black bow above its entrance, a sign of mourning, and also announced that staff would not be remaining at work past 8 in the evening. Mexia's death hit the national medical community at a moment when it was already raw from a sequence of violence against health workers in cartel-controlled areas. 4 days later, in Durango, the intern Eric David Andrade Ramirez would be shot dead inside his clinic, and the combination of the 2 killings within a single week would bring doctors and medical students into the streets of Ciudad Juarez and other cities for protests demanding that the government address the conditions it was imposing on medical workers in dangerous zones. The sign held by one protester captured the mood with a kind of bluntness that no official statement had matched. A dead doctor cannot save lives. Another protester's sign put the institutional question even more directly, asking why the government kept sending medical workers to places where even the National Guard would not enter. Mexico's then president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, cited the shortage of doctors willing to work in dangerous rural areas as justification for a controversial program bringing in Cuban physicians to fill vacant posts in those same communities. Within weeks of that statement, the Cuban doctor Ernesto Oliva Legra was shot dead inside a hospital on the outskirts of Mexico City. For Maciel Mexia's family, the grief had the particular weight of a loss that came at a specific, terrible moment. She had been a few days from seeing her daughter give a speech at kindergarten graduation. She had bought a house in the mountains 5 months earlier. She had written about her daughter on social media when Antonella was 2 years old, describing wanting to be present for every moment, to give her child everything, to watch her grow. The community had given Mexia a black bow on the hospital door and had dragged the man responsible to a utility pole before the day was out. The state of Chihuahua had opened an investigation. None of that changed the fact that Antonella turned 5 without her mother, and that the graduation Maciel had been planning to attend happened without her there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Maciel Mexia was killed in her own home in a mountain town 4 days before the next victim on this list, that next case moves not to a different state, but to a different kind of horror. A young medical intern shot dead inside his own clinic by someone he was actively trying to help, in a remote Durango community where armed men had walked into the local hospital and no one could stop them. Section 5. Dr. Eric David Andrade Ramirez, 4 days after Maciel Mexia was shot in her home in the Sierra Tarahumara, a 24-year-old medical intern named Eric David Andrade Ramirez was killed inside his own clinic while treating a patient in the state of Durango. The 2 deaths, 4 days apart and 1 state over from each other, hit the Mexican medical community in rapid succession in a way that made it impossible to absorb them one at a time. Colleagues processed the news of Mexia's killing, went back to their shifts, and then 4 days later received the news about Eric. The hashtags and the protest signs and the marches that followed were directed at both of them together, at a government that kept sending young doctors into the Sierra and then had nothing meaningful to offer when those doctors were killed. Before either story had fully resolved in the national conversation, both names had been folded into the same moment of collective grief and institutional anger. The municipality of Pueblo Nuevo lies in the southern part of Durango, in the mountainous Sierra country that forms the western spine of the state, where it meets Sinaloa. Durango has historically been one of the core states of the Golden Triangle, the production zone where marijuana and opium poppy cultivation has been concentrated for decades under the general dominance of the Sinaloa Cartel and its affiliated networks. Unlike Zacatecas to the east, where active fighting between the Sinaloa Cartel and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel had produced some of the highest homicide rates in the country, Durango, by 2022, was a state where the Sinaloa Cartel's dominance was relatively settled. Settled, in this context, does not mean safe. It means that the dominant criminal organization faced fewer active territorial challenges than in a contested state like Zacatecas, which produces a different kind of violence, more controlled in some ways, and in other ways more invisible, because the people doing the controlling have less reason to announce themselves publicly. The armed groups operating in the Sierra of Durango, including a Sinaloa-aligned cell known as Las Flechas MZ, maintained control over the mountain territory through extortion, the movement of drugs, and the willingness to use force against anyone who drew their attention in the wrong way. Pueblo Nuevo and its surrounding area had been specifically identified as a zone of significant cartel activity. The highway connecting Durango to Mazatlan, the main Pacific Coast resort city, runs through this terrain and has been documented by Mexican investigative journalists as a route regularly monitored and controlled by armed groups. The community of El Salto, within the municipality of Pueblo Nuevo, is where the Hospital Integral de El Salto sits, a regional facility that serves as the primary medical resource for a wide spread of mountain communities. Like the hospital in San Juanito, where Mexia had worked, the facility in El Salto was staffed in significant part by medical interns on mandatory social service placements, young people in the final stage of their medical education, assigned to remote areas because the government had not found another way to staff them. The only clinic in the immediate area, it operated with the thin staffing margins that characterize rural health facilities across the most isolated parts of Mexico. Eric David Andrade Ramirez was a student at the Autonomous University of Durango. He was 24 years old and approximately 2 weeks away from completing his social service placement when he was killed. His sister, Shuge Andrade, later described him publicly as the best older brother she could have had. Friends and colleagues described him as someone who genuinely wanted to help people, who had chosen medicine out of a sense of vocation rather than convenience, and who had spent his placement in El Salto doing the work seriously, even in a setting that offered very little in the way of comfort, safety, or support. 15 more days. He had done the year, done the remote posting, done the long shifts in a clinic in the Sierra, and had 15 days left. On the afternoon of Friday, July 15th, 2022, 3 vehicles pulled up to the Hospital Integral de El Salto. From them descended a group of around 8 or 9 people, 2 of whom appeared to be in need of medical attention, reportedly showing signs of severe intoxication from psychotropic substances. The remaining members of the group waited outside. The 2 who appeared to need treatment were brought inside and initially seen by the nursing staff on duty. The nurses began working with them, and then the situation in the consultation room began to deteriorate. The 2 patients grew agitated. They began arguing, their behavior becoming increasingly erratic and hostile. The nurses, recognizing that the situation was escalating beyond what they could safely manage, called for Eric. He came in, assessed what was happening, and made a decision that reflected exactly the kind of instinct that defines a good doctor working in a difficult environment. He sent the nurses out of the room. He told them he would handle it. he stayed. Whatever passed between Eric and the patients in the minutes that followed is not fully reconstructed in any official account. What the nurses and other clinic staff heard from outside the room was first the continuing sounds of agitation and then gunshots. When the door was opened, Eric David Andrade Ramirez was on the floor of the consultation room, shot multiple times in the head. The patients and the group waiting outside had fled. Investigators who arrived at the scene found the clinic and launched an immediate perimeter across the exits of the community, trying to locate the attacker before he could disappear into the Sierra. An emergency call had been received at the state prosecutor's line at 6:40 in the evening. By the following morning, the Durango State Attorney General reported that a suspect had been identified and taken into custody. A man named Jose Florentino, 21 years old, described as having been in a state of drug intoxication at the time of the shooting. Jose Florentino was processed and sent before the courts, but the prosecution of a single intoxicated young man told only part of the story of what had happened in that clinic and why. The deeper story involved the environment in which Eric had been placed, the organization that controlled that environment, and the man who would not be arrested for the killing for nearly 4 more years. Las Flechas MZ is a Sinaloa cartel-affiliated armed cell that emerged in the Sierra of Durango around 2020, operating under the broader network of the El Mayo Zambada faction of the cartel, led by a man known as El Flechas, whose real name is Francisco Javier. The group extended from Zacatecas into the Sierra of Durango, controlling territory through violence, extortion, and the use of armed men drawn from the local population and from Sinaloa. The connection between Las Flechas MZ and the killing of Eric Andrade became a matter of active judicial investigation. A separate figure within the same criminal network, known as El Cholo Flechas, was identified by prosecutors as having been involved in the attack at the hospital. According to later reporting by the newspaper Milenio and confirmed by the Durango State Prosecutor's Office, the young medical intern had died not because a single intoxicated patient lost control, but because the attack was connected to a criminal armed group that operated in the area. The exact chain of events between the cartel and what happened inside that consultation room on July 15th was never fully laid out in a single public statement, but the connection between the armed groups of the Sierra and the violence at the clinic was confirmed across multiple strands of official and journalistic investigation. The Durango Colegio Médico, the state's main medical association, responded to the killing within hours of the news breaking, calling for approximately 300 medical interns working in rural clinics and hospitals across the Sierra zone of Durango to return immediately to the city of Durango and abandon their placements. The directive was extraordinary, the equivalent of a professional body telling its newest members to walk off the job, and it communicated something that no official government statement had been willing to say directly. The Sierra was not safe for medical interns, had not been safe for years, and no official mechanism existed to make it safe. The Autonomous University of Durango, which Eric had attended, publicly mourned its student and joined the chorus of institutions demanding that the government address the conditions it was imposing on young medical professionals. The protests that followed were among the largest the medical community had staged in years. Doctors and students took to the streets in Ciudad Juarez, Durango City, Mexico City, and other urban centers, carrying signs that captured the moment with a bluntness that bypassed official language entirely. Signs reading "A dead doctor cannot save lives. Why are you killing us?" and "No more interns" became the language of a community that had watched 2 of its youngest members killed in the same week, in the same region, and had run out of patience with the cycle of condolence statements and promised reviews that never produced meaningful change. At one protest in the center of Durango, a group of doctors directly confronted the state governor, Jose Rosas Aispuro Torres, chanting at him as he attempted to explain the security protocols his administration had put in place following the killing. The confrontation was caught on video and spread widely online. The governor's promised protocols, his assurances that he had met with the Health Security Committee, his commitments to install panic buttons and cameras in rural clinics, all sounded precisely like what governors had promised after every similar death for years. The Durango Medical Association and the Mexican Medical Student Association both said so publicly. The case of Eric Andrade Ramirez also carried a particular institutional weight in the broader national conversation about Servicio Social, the mandatory social service system that had been sending medical students into exactly this kind of environment since 1936. Reports noted that between 2007 and 2015, 7 medical interns had been killed while fulfilling their placements. By 2022, the count was significantly higher by any honest accounting. The Mexican Association of Medical Students in Training issued a formal set of demands in the aftermath of Eric's death, requesting that health authorities stop offering social service positions in locations where security could not be guaranteed, that interns not be held solely responsible for community health care without supervision or support, and that a structural reform of the entire social service model be undertaken. These same demands had been made before. They would be made again. The arrest of Jose Florentino closed the immediate criminal case in the narrow sense that a suspect was identified and charged. What it did not close was the question of how deeply the criminal structure of the Sierra had reached into the events of that afternoon, and who, beyond a single intoxicated young man, bore responsibility for what happened to Eric Andrade inside his own clinic. That wider question remained open for nearly 4 years. On June 28, 2026, elements of the Mexican Army and the National Guard carried out an intelligence operation in the ecotourism area of Mexiquillo in the municipality of Pueblo Nuevo, detaining Francisco Javier, alias El Flechas, the man connected to Las Flechas MZ, who had been wanted on a standing arrest warrant, specifically in connection with the homicidio calificado, the qualified murder charge, tied to Eric's killing. The Durango State Attorney General confirmed the detention and stated that the legal process against El Flechas would proceed either concurrently with any federal charges he faced or consecutively after them. The office also announced that investigators were reaching out to Eric's father to explain the legal path forward. The first time in nearly 4 years that the family had received word that the man they believed responsible for their son's death was in custody. Eric David Andrade Ramirez had 2 weeks left. He had done the posting, survived the remote assignment, sent the nurses out of the room because he thought he could handle it and did not want them to be in danger. He died on the floor of a consultation room in a mountain clinic in Durango, shot multiple times by someone who had arrived in a vehicle with 8 or 9 companions and who left on foot the moment the shooting was over. 4 years later, the arrest of the cartel-connected figure believed to be behind the broader structure that produced the attack gave his family something approaching the beginning of accountability. What it could not give them was the 15 days he had left, or the career that never got to start. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Eric was killed in a clinic he believed was a place of safety, the next case on this list moves to a different kind of violence entirely. A doctor burned to death in his own truck in a hospital parking lot, targeted not for being in the wrong place, but seemingly for being exactly who he was, killed outside the very institution where he worked, just moments after finishing a night shift. Section 6. Dr. David Armando Suaifeta Mendez. The state of Morelos occupies a small and geographically central position in Mexico, a landlocked state, roughly the size of a county, ringed by the states of Mexico, Guerrero, and Puebla, and sitting just south of Mexico City. Despite its modest size, Morelos carries a disproportionate weight in any serious accounting of cartel violence in the country, because of what happened there in December 2009 when Mexican Navy forces killed Arturo Beltran Leiva, one of the most powerful traffickers in the country, in a shootout at a luxury apartment complex in Cuernavaca. That single killing did not end the Beltran Leiva cartel, it shattered it. And from the fragments, over the years that followed, emerged a landscape of competing successor organizations that by 2020 had made Morelos one of the more densely contested states in Mexico. Researchers at the Autonomous University of the State of Morelos documented at least 11 distinct criminal organizations operating across the state's 36 municipalities, including the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, La Familia Michoacana, Guerreros Unidos, Los Rojos, and smaller local cells that controlled specific corridors, neighborhoods, and revenue streams. Extortion was their most visible tool in civilian life, a cobro de piso, a floor payment demanded from businesses and professionals simply for the right to keep operating in cartel territory. Bars paid it, restaurants paid it, transport operators paid it, doctors paid it, or were threatened until they did. The southern corridor of Morelos, where the municipalities of Zacatepec, Jojutla, Puente de Ixtla, and Tlaquiltenango push against the Guerrero border, appeared in military intelligence analyses and journalistic investigations as one of the most multiply contested zones in the state. Los Rojos, a criminal group with roots in the old Beltran Leiva network, maintained active presence in Zacatepec specifically. Security analysts studying the state's criminal geography placed Zacatepec among the municipalities with the highest density of active criminal organization presence, with 7 separate groups identified as operating there. That kind of density does not produce stability. It produces competition, and competition produces violence of a particular kind, targeted, instrumental, often focused on eliminating anyone perceived as linked to a rival or as failing to meet the financial obligations the dominant group imposes. The medical community of southern Morelos had already received that message in the most direct way possible before November of 2020. On the night of April 10th of that year, 3 IMSS doctors, a gynecologist named Oscar Emetrio Ceballos, a general physician named Gerardo Urquiza Martinez, and an anesthesiologist named Jorge Luis Vidaña Marufo, were shot dead by a group of armed men in the community of Tilzapotla, in the neighboring municipality of Puente de Ixtla, just a short distance from Zacatepec. The official account framed the killing initially as a robbery of their Mercedes-Benz and personal belongings. 2 suspects were eventually arrested, and when their connections were traced, they led back to an armed cell linked to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. 3 IMSS doctors from the same regional hospital system as Suaifeta, killed 7 months before him in the same stretch of southern Morelos. The case had produced arrests. It had not produced safety. David Armando Suaifeta Mendez was a physician at IMSS Hospital General de Zona Número 5 in Zacatepec, a public facility serving the broader southern Morelos population. He came from a family with deep roots in both medicine and local civic life. His father, Juan David Suaifeta Gonzalez, was also a doctor and had served as a state legislator for the PRI from 2000 to 2003, presiding over the state legislative assembly during that period. He also directed a private clinic in Zacatepec called Clínica Sofía. David Armando had followed his father into medicine, choosing the public IMSS system and the harder work it represented. He was a surgeon, described by colleagues as exemplary, by friends as a loving son and father, and by a local legislator who mourned him publicly as a dear friend. He was, by every account available, a straightforward man doing a serious job in a place where that job had become increasingly dangerous simply by virtue of geography. The morning of Saturday, November 21st, 2020, began in the ordinary way of a hospital night shift's end. David Armando had been working his guardia, his overnight shift, through the hours before dawn. At some point between 4:30 and 6:40 in the morning, his shift complete, he walked out of the hospital and got into his black Chevrolet Silverado truck, which was parked in the exterior lot of the hospital on Avenida Lázaro Cárdenas in the center of Zacatepec. What happened in the minutes that followed is the subject of a direct and documented disagreement between what local sources reported and what the state prosecutor's office later formally concluded, and both accounts deserve to be laid out honestly rather than collapsed into one version. The initial account came first. Local police sources, the weekly magazine Proceso, and a Facebook page called Narco Morelos Zona Sur, which regularly publishes reporting on criminal activity in that part of the state, all described the same thing: an attack. Armed men approached the truck while Suaifeta was inside. They shot him. Then they threw Molotov cocktails at the vehicle. The fire consumed the front of the truck rapidly and burned Suaifeta's body. Investigators reportedly found spent bullet casings around the vehicle in the immediate aftermath. A separate vehicle, later found to have a stolen license plate, was abandoned in the parking lot area, apparently left behind by whoever had carried out the attack, and fled. The Narco Morelos Zona Sur account went further, attributing the killing to a specific criminal cell operating in the zone, and stating that the motive was Suaifeta's refusal to pay extortion, naming the group as associated with figures known by the nicknames El Crepsi and El Kali. None of that attribution was confirmed by any official source at any point in the investigation. The Morelos State Prosecutor's Office issued a formal forensic conclusion that flatly contradicted the attack narrative. According to the official account, the evidence collected by the state's Criminalistics and Explosives Unit showed no trace of external incendiary agents, no Molotov cocktails, no accelerant residue consistent with a deliberate external fire. Instead, the forensic team found signs of electrical overheating in the fuse box distribution lines of the vehicle itself. The conclusion drawn was that Suaifeta had completed his shift, climbed into the truck, activated the air conditioning, and fallen asleep. He was exhausted after a night of hospital work. While he slept, an electrical fault caused a fire inside the cabin. Carbon monoxide rendered him unconscious before he could respond. He died of what the official autopsy described as generalized visceral congestion caused by carbon monoxide inhalation. His body showed burns across roughly 85% of its surface. The prosecutor's conclusion was stated in a written communiqué posted publicly. The cause of the fire was not intentional and not externally provoked. No arrest was ever made in connection with what happened to David Armando Suaifeta Mendez. The case as an act of criminal violence was never prosecuted because the official record classified it as an accident. The bullet casings initially referenced by police sources were not mentioned in any subsequent official statement. The abandoned vehicle in the parking lot, which multiple reports described as having been left by the attackers, was not publicly addressed in the prosecutor's formal account of events. The cartel-linked social media page's attribution of motive and perpetrators remained entirely outside the official record, unconfirmed and uncontested in any judicial forum. What the Morelos state prosecutors concluded, publicly and formally, was that an IMSS doctor fell asleep in his truck after a night shift and died because his truck caught fire. The gap between those two accounts was wide enough that it did not quietly disappear. Colleagues and friends of Suaifeta went onto social media and into the streets, demanding justice for what they understood to be a targeted killing. The Morelos Colegio de Médicos, the state's main professional medical body, issued a public statement of grief. A local legislator, representing the district where Suaifeta lived and worked, published an open message calling for the authorities to clarify the facts and bring those responsible to justice. The IMSS itself released a careful institutional statement confirming that a fire had occurred in the hospital parking lot, that it would cooperate with all investigations, and that the hospital's services had not been affected. None of those responses engaged directly with the prosecutor's accident conclusion, perhaps because the conclusion had been issued so quickly and had left so many specific questions from the initial reports unanswered. This kind of contested truth is not unusual in the landscape of cartel violence in Morelos. The state's security machinery in 2020 operated under documented conditions of deep institutional compromise. Military intelligence assessments and journalistic investigations both found that a significant portion of local government officials across Morelos's municipalities had documented connections to one or more of the 11 criminal organizations operating in the state. The same forensic and investigative offices whose findings determined the cause of death in any given case were embedded in an institutional environment where cartel influence had reached all the way into municipal governments, police commands, and prosecutorial offices. That does not mean any specific conclusion was wrong. It means that any conclusion issued without arrest, without suspect, without a full public accounting of the initial physical evidence, and without explanation of the abandoned vehicle and the reported shell casings, exists in a context where the community had very good reason to ask whether the official version was the complete one. What the case of David Armando Suaifeta Mendez established, regardless of which version of events is accurate, is something about what it meant to be a medical professional in southern Morelos in the year 2020. 7 months earlier, 3 of his IMSS colleagues had been shot dead in a beer house in Puente de Ixtla, and their killers had been linked to the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Those 3 doctors were still without full justice when Suaifeta died. The wider environment in which both events occurred was one in which extortion of medical professionals was documented by security analysts, in which criminal organizations had infiltrated local institutions to the point that researchers could map their presence across nearly every corner of the state, and in which the distinction between dying because a cartel wanted you dead and dying because an electrical fault burned your truck was, from the outside, almost impossible to confirm or rule out with any certainty. His father, Juan David, who had spent years in public service and who directed a clinic in the same town, learned about his son's death in that parking lot. He had watched the 3 Puente de Ixtla doctors killed 7 months earlier in the municipality, just a few kilometers away. He had raised his son in a profession built on service to others, had watched him choose the public hospital system over easier alternatives, and now faced the process of identifying his son through whatever forensic evidence remained after the fire had done its work across 85% of his body. Colleagues and friends filled social media in the hours after the news broke with messages demanding not just condolences, but answers. The medical community of Morelos had been hearing those demands for years. They had not yet produced answers that felt complete. No one was ever charged. No suspect was ever named publicly in any criminal proceeding. The questions that surrounded that finding, rooted in the initial physical evidence described by police sources, the abandoned vehicle, the social media reports, and the context of 11 competing criminal organizations operating in a municipality with documented histories of medical extortion and doctor killings, did not go away simply because a formal conclusion had been issued. They remained, as they so often do, in cases like this one, somewhere in the space between the official record and the memory of the people who knew David Armando Suaifeta Mendez and who drove past that IMSS parking lot on Avenida Lázaro Cárdenas every day, knowing that he had not come home from his shift. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the truth of what happened to Dr. Suaifeta disappeared into the gap between the official record and the community's own account of that morning, the next case leaves no ambiguity at all. A Cuban doctor 2 years into a new life in Mexico was shot dead inside his hospital when armed men stormed a second-floor medical ward looking for someone else, opened fire on whoever was in their path, and walked out through a door a receptionist had been forced to unlock at gunpoint. Section 7. Dr. Samuel Alari Perez Lara. On October 23, 2017, Dr. Samuel Alari Perez Lara celebrated Dia del Médico, Mexico's National Doctors' Day, at the Hospital Materno Perinatal in Toluca, Estado de México. He posted photographs to social media from the event, a birthday-style gathering of doctors in training, residents he supervised, colleagues who had become friends. In one photograph, his face shows a wide, unguarded smile. He wrote a caption in Spanish, 2 words, "Me siento feliz," I feel happy. He had no apparent reason to feel otherwise. He was 31 years old, a gynecologist and obstetrician with 2 hospital positions, a professional trajectory that was going exactly the way it was supposed to go, and a life that people who knew him described in the consistent language of someone they expected to be around for a long time. His cousin Beatriz Villegas described him to the news outlet Sin Embargo as una buena persona, entregado a su trabajo, a good person, devoted to his work. He was 3 weeks away from disappearing. The Sunday of November 12, 2017, Samuel was in Temascalcingo, a municipality in the northeastern part of Estado de México, close to the border with Michoacán. He worked in Temascalcingo alongside his main position in Toluca, serving a community hospital there as part of his professional practice. He was supposed to return to Toluca that evening. His mother, Araceli, called his phone. It rang. He did not answer. He was supposed to come home and never did. His roommate and colleagues noted his absence. He did not show up for work the following Monday. He did not appear at the hospital where he supervised residents who relied on him. The absence was the detonator. His colleagues, his family, and the investigators who were called immediately understood that this was not a missed phone call or a changed plan. Samuel Alari Perez Lara, born May 1, 1986, 1 meter 95 kilos, dark complexion, short curly black hair, and light brown eyes, had vanished from the road between Temascalcingo and Toluca. State prosecutors in Estado de México opened a disappearance file and issued an urgent bulletin. The family searched. Colleagues marched in Mexico City the following weekend, carrying signs demanding justice for Samuel, adding his name to a list of physicians who had been killed or taken that year, a list that was growing with each month. The movement of doctors and medical students that had formed under the name Yo Soy 17, a reference to the 17 medical specialties and the professional rights of physicians, had begun tracking violence against the medical community systematically, and its founders said publicly that in 2017 alone, 16 doctors had been killed in Mexico, a figure the Federal Health Ministry disputed, saying 35 had been killed in the previous 9 years. The gap between those numbers reflected not a factual debate, but an institutional refusal to count what the community itself could plainly see. That being a doctor in certain parts of Mexico had become a profession with a mortality risk that bore no relationship to the work itself. To understand what happened to Samuel Alari, you need to understand Temascalcingo and the territory it sits in, because the geography explains everything that followed. Temascalcingo is in the area of Estado de México that borders Michoacán and Guerrero, a region that security analysts and journalists describe as Tierra Caliente, even when they are technically speaking of the Estado de México portion rather than the Michoacán or Guerrero portions of that name. The Tierra Caliente corridor, stretching across those 3 states, is one of the most continuously and violently contested drug territories in Mexico. By 2017, Estado de México alone was tracking the active presence of at least 4 major criminal organizations in the municipalities of its southern zone, including the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, La Nueva Familia Michoacana, Guerreros Unidos, and Los Rojos. The municipalities specifically identified in security analyses as affected by cartel presence and violence included Luvianos, Tejupilco, Tlatlaya, Temascaltepec, San Simón, and Temascalcingo, where Samuel was last seen. A Milenio investigative report published around the time of Samuel's disappearance, based on interviews with medical professionals in the area and with regional health authorities, documented what those working in that zone had already known for years, that cartel groups operating in southern Estado de Mexico had been systematically seizing doctors at gunpoint, holding them against their will, forcing them to provide medical care for wounded fighters, and in several cases, killing them afterward. The state's health secretary, Gabriel O'Shea, confirmed on record that the phenomenon was real, that medical workers in Temascaltepec, Luvianos, Tejupilco, Tlatlaya, and San Simón had been subjected to kidnappings, threats, extortion, and forced medical labor. Clinics in communities across the area had been closed not because of funding gaps, but because no doctor was willing to work there anymore. The state had a deficit of roughly 2,000 physicians, with 60% of that deficit concentrated in the southern zone. The Milenio report noted that among the few cases that had produced a criminal investigation were those of doctors who had been seized and then killed, and named Samuel Perez Lara specifically, placing his disappearance in this documented pattern. There is no publicly available account of exactly what happened to Samuel between the moment he was last seen near Temascalcingo on November 12th and the moment his body was found. The time between those two events was approximately 3 months. The Estado de Mexico prosecutors confirmed he had disappeared. The family waited through November, through December, through January. His mother had told reporters during that period, in a statement that carried the specific weight of a parent who has already understood something their official statement has not yet confirmed. "I prayed to God that if he was attending to someone, they would let him come home." That framing, the conditional, the image of her son working in darkness with a gun at his back, trying to make the patient survive so that he would be allowed to live, was not a rhetorical flourish. It was a mother describing what she believed was happening to her son, based on what she knew about what cartel groups in that region did with doctors they seized. In February of 2018, approximately 14 weeks after Samuel Alari Perez Lara disappeared from the road between Temascalcingo and Toluca, his body was found. It had been dismembered. It was found near the city of Querétaro, across the state border from Estado de Mexico. The manner of death was documented as asphyxiation. He had been kept alive for some period of time before being killed, and the cause of death when it came was not from a shooting, but from suffocation. The dismemberment came after death. His remains were transported back to his family, and he was buried. His sister Nancy, who had spoken to journalists during the months he was missing, described the investigation in the months that followed as a process in which authorities transferred the case file from one office to another and resolved nothing. Araceli, his mother, had not yet received answers a year after his body was returned to them. The investigation into his kidnapping and murder, as of the reporting available in this period, produced no arrests that were publicly announced. The account of Samuel Alari Perez Lara's death lives at the intersection of two things that are separately documented and mutually reinforcing: a pattern of cartel violence against doctors in Tierra Caliente that is fully established in the public record through the Milenio investigation and through official statements from health and security officials, and the specific trajectory of one man whose disappearance, captivity, and killing followed the pattern so precisely that his case was used by the investigators themselves as an example of what the pattern produces. He was not randomly chosen. He was a doctor working in Temascalcingo, a municipality that multiple criminal organizations had identified as their operational territory. He was seized because cartel fighters need medical care, because they cannot go to public hospitals without risking arrest, and because the solution they had developed to that problem was simply to take the nearest available physician and compel them to work. The founders of the Yo Soy 17 movement, which had begun in 2014 in response to criminal cases against IMSS doctors and had evolved into a broader advocacy movement for medical worker safety, described the dynamic in plain terms in the period around Samuel's death. Doctors assigned to rural communities in cartel active zones were being seized by armed groups, ordered to treat wounded fighters in hidden locations, paid in cash in some cases, and then, depending on whether the patient survived and depending on the particular cell doing the holding, either released or killed. The groups operating in Tierra Caliente viewed doctors not as professionals to be protected, but as a resource to be seized the way they seized anything else of operational value. The fact that Samuel had no conflict with any criminal organization, had no debts, had no involvement with anyone associated with cartels, mattered not at all. What mattered was that he was a gynecologist and obstetrician working in Temascalcingo, that the armed groups in that area knew it, and that on the night of November 12th, they needed a doctor. His family was left with what families in his situation are always left with: a body returned months later, a case file that went nowhere, and the task of absorbing an injustice that the system that should have prevented it had acknowledged was happening and had not stopped. The state health secretary had named the municipalities. The investigators knew the pattern. The clinics in the surrounding area had already been closed because doctors refused to go. Samuel had gone. He had posted a photograph of himself smiling 3 weeks before his disappearance and written "Me siento feliz" and supervised residents who depended on him and called a community in which 4 competing criminal organizations operated home for part of his working week, and he had not known that the last one of those facts would determine the end of all the others. The system that sent him to Temascalcingo without protection, that documented the kidnapping pattern and continued to assign physicians to the zone, that responded to his disappearance with a case file transferred across offices for months without result. That system's failures were not incidental to his death. They were structural. The cartel didn't distinguish between what Samuel Alari Perez Lara was and what they needed him to be. To them, he was a physician in range, and that was enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cartel's willingness to walk into any space and take what it needed didn't stop at the roadside or the rural clinic. The next case on this list takes us inside a hospital in one of the most densely populated cities on Earth, where 2 armed men entered a maternity ward looking for a woman who wasn't there and opened fire on the people who were. Section 8. Dr. Ernesto Oliva Legra Ecatepec de Morelos is one of the largest municipalities in Mexico, a vast, densely populated suburb that presses hard against the northeastern edge of Mexico City like an overfull room that ran out of wall space. More than 1.5 million people live there, packed into neighborhood after neighborhood of low concrete buildings, market stalls, busy intersections, and the particular kind of urban exhaustion that comes from too many people trying to survive in a place that was never quite built to hold them all. It borders the capital but is not part of it, and that distinction matters because it means Ecatepec sits outside the administrative structures that give Mexico City its relatively lower homicide rate, outside the special federal programs that have historically concentrated security resources on the capital itself, and inside a state, Estado de Mexico, where multiple criminal organizations compete for control of drug distribution, extortion revenue, and territory. For years, Ecatepec appeared on Mexican government lists of the cities with the highest total number of murder investigations opened in the country. alongside places far more famous for their cartel violence like Acapulco, Tijuana, Culiacán, and Ciudad Juárez. Analysts studying the municipality noted that unlike those other cities, Ecatepec's violence did not stem primarily from wars between major trafficking organizations fighting over drug corridors. It came from something more diffuse and in its own way harder to contain. Dozens of locally rooted criminal groups, some with connections to larger organizations like the Familia Michoacana or the remnants of the Beltran Leyva network, others operating more independently, all of them competing over retail drug sales, extortion rackets, and control of specific streets and commercial zones within a municipality so large that effective policing across all of it was close to impossible. Extortion was the force that connected most of this violence to ordinary life in Ecatepec. Businesses paid it, or faced consequences. Clinic owners paid it. Family doctors working in the neighborhood had been publicly documented as targets, including one case that drew wide reporting in which a physician who killed 2 of the 3 armed men who entered his waiting room to collect protection money afterward lived under round-the-clock police guard, wearing a bulletproof vest under his medical coat, afraid to leave the building. The threat to medical workers in Ecatepec was not abstract or theoretical. It was structural, embedded in the criminal economy of a place where armed groups viewed any visible commercial enterprise, including a small private hospital on a residential street, as a potential source of revenue or a potential problem to be managed. The Colonia Tierra Blanca neighborhood sits within Ecatepec, and it was there, on the street called Puerto Campeche, that the Unidad Materno-Infantil Ecatepec operated in August of 2022. It was a private maternity and infant care clinic, a small facility by the standards of large urban hospitals, the kind of place where young mothers came to deliver babies, where nurses worked overnight shifts in quiet wards, and where a doctor on duty might expect the kinds of crises that belong to obstetric medicine rather than the ones that walk in through the front door carrying weapons. Ernesto Oliva Legra was working a night shift there in the early hours of Friday, August 12th. Ernesto Oliva Legra was 32 years old and had been born in Santiago de Cuba, the country's second-largest city on the eastern end of the island. He had trained as a physician in Cuba, which produces significantly more doctors per capita than nearly any other country in the world, and has a long history of sending medical professionals abroad under bilateral government agreements with other nations. Ernesto, however, was not part of any government program. He had come to Mexico 3 years earlier, on his own, on a path that many Cuban medical professionals have taken, building a private life in a country where their credentials could be revalidated and where the economic possibilities were broader than what Cuba itself offered. He had established his legal residence properly. When investigators later identified his body, they confirmed it through a document issued by Mexico's National Migration Institute, the official proof of his legal status in the country. He had built a life in Ecatepec, working at the Unidad Materno-Infantil, embedded enough in the local medical community that his death was first announced online, not by authorities, but by a colleague named Edgar Martinez Aguilar, a worker at a nearby state social security hospital who knew who Ernesto was and felt the responsibility to tell people. Around 3 in the morning on August 12th, 2 men arrived at the reception desk of the Unidad Materno-Infantil. They presented themselves as relatives of a patient. This is a common and effective form of deception at a maternity clinic, where visitors coming to see new mothers or their newborns are a normal part of the night's activity, where the assumption runs toward allowing entry rather than denying it. The receptionist on duty had no immediate reason to see these particular men differently from anyone else who arrived on behalf of a family member. The men asked for a patient by the name of Elizabeth. There was no record of any patient by that name admitted to the clinic. No Elizabeth had checked in. The woman they were looking for was not there. What that meant, in practice, depended entirely on who was asking and why. For men who had come to a hospital in the middle of the night armed with weapons, the absence of their target was not a reason to leave quietly. It was a problem to be solved some other way. The receptionist, now facing two visibly armed men whose disposition had changed the moment they heard that Elizabeth was not in the system, was threatened. Under that threat, the receptionist unlocked the door that led from the ground floor reception area to the second floor medical ward. It was the door that separated the public entry from the clinical space where patients were being treated and staff were working. The two men went through it and climbed to the second floor. What the prosecutor's report described next, confirmed by the Estado de Mexico Attorney General's office in a statement to Aristegui Noticias, was that Ernesto Oliva Legra had been on duty when the situation at the reception desk unfolded. He came out to see what was happening. He was a doctor in his own hospital, investigating a disturbance in the space where he worked, acting on exactly the professional instinct that had put him in that building in the first place. When he appeared in the area near the door, one of the armed men shot him in the head. The two men then went to the second floor. On that ward, they shot and killed a young nurse, identified in reporting only by her first name, Abigail, who was approximately 20 years old. They also shot and killed a woman in her 50s or 60s who had come to the clinic to visit a relative receiving treatment, a woman who had no connection to whatever conflict had brought these two men through the door. Then they left. 3 people were dead or fatally wounded. The woman they had been looking for was nowhere in the building. Ernesto did not die immediately. He was transported alive, with a gunshot wound to his head, to a separate hospital with higher-level trauma capacity. He died there some hours after the attack. By that point, his colleagues at the hospital, where he had been treated, confirmed his death, and the news began moving through medical networks and through Cuban exile's social media. His cousin Yarine Noa Matos wrote on Facebook, in words that did not require translation to understand the weight of what had happened to her family. Her cousin had left Cuba for Mexico to build a better life, she said, and instead, someone had shot him in the head after confusing him with someone else. His uncle Rafael Legra wrote his own farewell publicly, addressing Ernesto as the son he had always treated him as, not merely a nephew. His sister Rocio wrote that she had run out of words to describe the pain. The Estado de Mexico prosecutor's office confirmed the 3 deaths, opened a homicide investigation, and began coordinating with the Cuban embassy in Mexico City on the process of repatriating Ernesto's remains to Cuba so that his family on the island could receive him. They confirmed that Ernesto had been a physician working legally in Mexico, documented by his National Migration Institute paperwork, and that he had not been any part of the federal government's recently announced program to hire Cuban doctors to serve in underserved areas of Mexico. That clarification mattered enormously in the days that followed, because the federal government's first public response to news of the killing was to deny it ever happened. On August 15th, 3 days after the attack, Mexico's Secretary of the Interior, Adán Augusto López, addressed the death at a federal security press conference. His response was not condolence or acknowledgement. He called it a lie. He stated, confidently, that the government had no report of such an incident, and suggested that because the Cuban doctors the federal program had recruited were stationed in Nayarit and Colima, any claim about a Cuban doctor dying in Ecatepec must simply be false. The Estado de Mexico prosecutor's office had already publicly confirmed the death. The Cuban embassy in Mexico City was already in contact with authorities about the body. The family of Ernesto Oliva Legra had already been posting their grief and their photographs online for days. The Secretary of the Interior called it una mentirita, a little lie. He was corrected by the very facts he was dismissing. The prosecutor's office confirmation stood. The repatriation process proceeded. The investigation file was opened, and the triple homicide was entered into the official record, exactly as it had occurred. The federal denial in the face of confirmed state-level acknowledgement was not an isolated moment of confusion. It reflected something specific about how the killing landed in the political context of August 2022. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador had, earlier that summer, announced and defended a program to hire 500 Cuban doctors to serve communities in Mexico where Mexican doctors were either absent or unwilling to work because of danger. The program was politically contentious. Critics on both left and right questioned the terms of the arrangement, the medical credentials involved, and what proportion of the pay would flow back to the Cuban government rather than to the doctors themselves. Mexican doctors had publicly pushed back, arguing that the government was using the Cuban program as a politically convenient response to a structural problem rather than addressing why Mexican doctors refused to work in dangerous areas in the first place. When Ernesto Oliva Legra was killed, the story landed in the middle of that argument. Federal officials had a clear political interest in distinguishing between the contracted Cuban doctors, safely deployed, accounted for, away from Ecatepec, and this particular Cuban doctor, who had arrived independently, worked in an urban zone the program had nothing to do with, and died in a private maternity clinic in a neighborhood where criminal violence had been claiming lives for years. The effort to distance the two stories was understandable as a political calculation. It did not change what had happened to Ernesto. The broader context in which his death occurred, and in which the two women killed alongside him died, was one the Mexican medical community had been documenting and protesting through that entire year. The organization Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition, which tracks violence against healthcare workers globally, reported in 2022 that Mexico had documented more violent incidents against health workers that year than any other country in Latin America. The incidents included killings, kidnappings, and damage or destruction of medical facilities. The pattern of armed groups entering hospitals was well documented across Mexico by that point, with specific cases in Guanajuato showing criminal organizations taking over emergency rooms and operating theaters, forcing surgeons to treat wounded fighters, and in some instances, finishing off patients from rival groups who were receiving care. Attacks by drug cartel gunmen on ambulances and hospitals while hunting wounded rivals had been described by the Associated Press, in coverage directly connected to this period, as a persistent problem across the country. Ernesto Oliva Legra was not killed because anyone was hunting him specifically, because he had done anything to draw criminal attention, or because his small maternity clinic had been targeted for any strategic reason. He was killed because two men, looking for a woman named Elizabeth, could not find her, and he walked toward the commotion in his own hospital the way a doctor on duty does when something is wrong. No arrests were ever announced in the case of the triple homicide at the Unidad Materno-Infantil Ecatepec. The Estado de Mexico prosecutor's office confirmed the investigation had been opened and the file had been designated for homicide charges, but as of available public reporting, no suspects were formally charged. The identities of the two gunmen were never made public. The identity of the woman named Elizabeth, the person they had been searching for and failed to find, was never disclosed. Whatever conflict had driven two armed men to a maternity clinic at 3 a.m. to look for a specific woman, whatever dispute, whatever threat, whatever chain of criminal logic had ended at that reception desk, was never resolved in any public accounting. The nurse Abigail, roughly 20 years old, was killed in the ward where she worked, in the middle of a shift, by men who had no more reason to be in that hospital than to find someone who wasn't there. The visiting woman in her 50s or 60s died because she was in the wrong room at the wrong moment. And Ernesto Oliva Legra, 32 years old, who had built a legal, documented life in Mexico 3 years after leaving Santiago de Cuba, who had trained as a physician and found a place to practice, died because he heard a disturbance and came out to see what was happening. His remains were repatriated to Cuba. His family received him, The investigation stayed open in the official paperwork of the Estado de Mexico prosecutor's office and produced nothing that reached the public record. A federal official had called the news of his death a lie before the body was even in the ground. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happened in Ecatepec was a hospital invaded and 3 people killed in the search for someone who wasn't there. The next case on this list moves to the capital of a state controlled by one of the most powerful drug cartels in Mexico, where 3 armed men walked into a private hospital just before midnight, tried to execute a patient, and a doctor died in the gun battle that followed, described publicly by the state's own police chief as collateral damage. Section 9. Dr. Otniel Everardo Montoya, Ureta. Before the events of September 28, 2023 are described, one fact needs to be named clearly at the outset. The doctor who died that night was not officially identified by the Sinaloa state government in its initial statements. His name entered the public record through his colleagues, his professional association, and the community he came from, not through any government press release or official identification. His name was Otniel Everardo Montoya Ureta. His colleagues at the Sinaloa Society of Emergency Medicine Specialists knew him. The people of La Esperanza, the small community in the municipality of Angostura, where he had grown up, knew him. His wife knew him. His 2 small daughters knew him. The state's own police chief, Gerardo Merida Sanchez, described his death publicly to reporters the following day, using one phrase: collateral damage. That is how the Sinaloa government chose to characterize the killing of a doctor inside his own hospital during a cartel hit that nobody had warned him was coming. The Clínica Hospital Culiacán sits on Mariano Escobedo Street in the historic center of Culiacán, capital of the state of Sinaloa. Culiacán is not simply a city. It is the home base of one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, the Sinaloa Cartel, which has used the city as its operational center for decades. The cartel's reach into the institutions, economy, and physical space of Culiacán is so deeply embedded that security analysts and journalists who cover organized crime in Mexico treat the city as an almost entirely separate category from other Mexican cities when discussing what the relationship between civilian life and criminal violence looks like at ground level. Major cartel operations, the arrest or killing of significant figures, and internal power shifts within the Sinaloa organization itself produce waves of violence that wash directly through the city's streets, its hospitals, its schools, and its markets. The months around September 2023 were particularly charged. The cartel was in the middle of an escalating internal power struggle between the faction loyal to Ismael El Mayo Zambada and the faction associated with the sons of imprisoned leader Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, known collectively as Los Chapitos. That fracture, which would eventually explode into open warfare the following year after Zambada's arrest, was already generating violence in the mountains of Badiraguato and Sinaloa's Sierra country and producing casualties that then had to be transported down from the highlands to the hospitals and clinics of Culiacán. The Sierra of Badiraguato is a name that appears throughout the history of the Sinaloa cartel because it is where many of the cartel's most significant figures, including El Chapo himself, were born and raised. The highland communities of Badiraguato have been cartel country for generations, contested ground where different factions move, supply themselves, and occasionally fight. On September 23, 2023, 5 days before the events at the Clínica Hospital Culiacán, a man named Silvano from the community of San Javier in the Sierra of Badiraguato was shot on a road between San José del Llano and San José de los Pacheco. He had been wounded by gunfire serious enough to require urgent medical care. He was transported down from the Sierra to Culiacán and admitted to the Clínica Hospital Culiacán, a private facility with intensive care capacity. Silvano arrived with a bullet wound to the head. Private clinics in Culiacan that treat gunshot wounds from cartel-related violence occupy a particular and dangerous position in the city's geography of conflict. They are not simply medical facilities. They become sites of ongoing violence for the simple reason that in the Sinaloa cartel's world, a wounded enemy left alive in a hospital is a problem left unfinished. The people who shot Silvano had not finished what they started. His enemies knew where he had been taken, and whoever Silvano was connected to, whichever armed faction had reason to keep him alive, they knew that the people who had shot him would eventually come for him in the clinic. So Silvano did not arrive at the Clínica Hospital Culiacan alone. He arrived with armed men who stayed inside the facility with him, positioned in the clinic as protection, waiting for exactly the threat that materialized 5 days later. The clinic itself had not reported any of this to the state police. According to Sinaloa's Public Security Secretary, Gerardo Merida Sanchez, who laid out the sequence of events at a press conference the following day, the clinic had admitted a patient with a gunshot wound who came accompanied by armed guards and had not notified the authorities. This was not necessarily an unusual omission in Culiacan's private medical sector. Journalists and medical professionals in the city had documented for years that private clinics routinely accepted patients with gunshot wounds without reporting them, out of fear of exactly the kind of consequences that come from becoming known to local cartel factions as a clinic that calls the police on their people. The calculus was simple and brutal. Reporting to the authorities might bring cartel retaliation, while treating the patient quietly kept the clinic out of the conflict. That calculus failed completely on the evening of September 28th. Otniel Everardo Montoya Ureta had been born in La Esperanza, a community in the municipality of Angostura, in the agricultural flatlands of Sinaloa's coastal zone, far from the mountains and the cartel strongholds of the Sierra. Angostura is sugarcane and farming country, the kind of municipality where a young man who wanted to be a doctor was making a choice to go somewhere else for training and come back to serve, or to build a career in the nearest major city. Otniel chose medicine and made his way through medical school and then residency, completing his specialty training in urgentology, the branch of medicine focused on stabilizing acute, sudden, or life-threatening conditions, in 2020, 3 years before the night that killed him. He was described by colleagues at the Sinaloa Society of Emergency Medicine Specialists, the professional organization for his specialty, as a great person, as someone they called a friend, and by people from his hometown as a man with 0 vices and 0 bad habits, serious and principled in a way that stood out. He had been working at the Clínica Hospital Culiacan on weekdays and at the IMSS clinic in Guamuchil on weekends. He had a wife. He had 2 small daughters. One of those daughters, according to the weekly newspaper Rio Doce, which covered the case in careful detail, was very recently born. Otniel had finished his residency 3 years earlier and was, in the precise words of the Sinaloa Secretary of Health, Cuitláhuac González Galindo, who sent his official condolences the following day, barely starting his medical career in the private sector. On the evening of September 28, 2023, shortly after 8 in the evening, 2 men entered the Clínica Hospital Culiacan. Security camera footage from inside the clinic, which local media obtained and published in the day following the attack, showed the 2 men moving through the hospital's corridors with weapons visible, while staff, patients, and family members in the building tried to move out of their path or find cover. The men had come to finish off Silvano in his hospital bed. What they had not accounted for was that the people inside the clinic who had been protecting Silvano were armed and prepared to resist exactly this kind of attack. When the hit squad moved through the building toward its target, the men guarding Silvano opened fire. The The two groups exchanged gunfire inside the corridors and rooms of a functioning private hospital in downtown Culiacan. Otniel Everardo Montoya Ureta was killed during that exchange. He was in the clinic doing his job. The best reconstruction available from the reporting by Ria Doce, Infobay, and El Heraldo de Mexico indicates that he was in or near the area where the gunfire broke out, most likely attending to patients in that part of the building when the confrontation began. He was found dead in the hallway of the clinic. The two men who had entered the building to carry out the execution were both killed during the gunfight, one by the armed men protecting the patient, and one who was captured wounded, transported to the Hospital General de Culiacan for emergency treatment, and died there after attempting to grab a police officer's weapon during his transport. The patient Silvano, whose presence in the clinic had been the reason for everything that followed, also died. He had been moved from the clinic after the attack for specialized care at the Hospital General, and his condition was critical enough from his original head wound that the confrontation with the police officer during transport, in which the officer's weapon discharged, finished what the original attack 5 days earlier in the Sierra had started. The Sinaloa Society of Emergency Medicine Specialists put out a formal statement the same day, calling Otniel, their colleague, their friend, a great person, and a victim of violent events during his work as a physician. They demanded justice from the authorities and named explicitly the insecurity that the medical community in Mexico was living under. Colleagues and people who had known him from Angostura posted their grief on his social media accounts, addressing him in the language that people use for someone they genuinely loved: an excellent human being, a friend, a co-worker, a son, a husband, a father. What injustice, one message read. You dedicated yourself to saving lives, and no one was there to save yours. His body was brought home to La Esperanza, Angostura, the night of September 30th, arriving in a funeral car at the house where his family waited: his wife, his daughters, his parents, the people who had watched him grow up and choose medicine and build the beginning of a life that ended at the Clínica Hospital Culiacan on a Thursday evening at the age of approximately 40. The Sinaloa Secretary of Health expressed condolences. The State Security Secretary held his press conference and explained the sequence of events. The State Prosecutor's Office opened an investigation. No arrests were announced in the weeks and months that followed, in any reporting accessible to the public. The two gunmen who entered the clinic were dead. Whatever armed faction had sent them, whatever chain of command had ordered the hospital execution, was never publicly identified, never charged, and never held accountable for the death of the doctor who happened to be standing in their path. The Proceso Weekly, which published a detailed investigative piece on the broader pattern of hospital attacks in Culiacan several days after the killing, noted starkly that as far as Otniel's murder was concerned, there were no certainties about justice, that the presumed attackers had been killed, and that the young doctor who had just finished his residency and was barely beginning his specialty career had died, leaving two daughters orphaned, one of them newborn. The reporting in Proceso also drew out a pattern that the events of September 28th fit into precisely. It documented that hospital attacks in Culiacan had been a recurring feature of cartel violence for years, including a March 2020 incident in which a gun battle between Mexican army elements and armed civilians moved directly into the emergency ward of the IMSS Hospital General in the city, trapping hospital workers inside. The magazine consulted a senior internist from Culiacan who asked to remain anonymous, and that doctor's statement captured something that the phrase collateral damage, offered by the state's own police chief, did not: that no camera system, no security protocol, no alarm button, no barrier that any hospital could install moved faster than a bullet already in the air. The medical community in Sinaloa knew this. They had known it for years. The question that followed the death of Otniel Montoya, just as it had followed every similar death before his, was not whether this would happen again, but when. The word collateral, used officially to describe what happened to a doctor in his own hospital during a cartel execution attempt, carries a specific weight. It is the language of acceptable loss, of deaths that happen adjacent to the real action rather than at its center. The people who planned the hit on Silvano did not plan to kill a doctor named Otniel Everardo Montoya Ureta. They planned to kill a man who had survived being shot in the Sierra of Badiraguato and made the mistake of being taken to a clinic with an armed security detail. What they also planned, whether they thought of it in these terms or not, was to conduct a lethal operation inside a functioning hospital in the center of a major Mexican city, and in doing that, they accepted that anyone who happened to be in the corridors when the shooting started was simply part of the terrain. The state's own police chief accepted that framing when he used the word collateral. The medical community of Sinaloa rejected it and said so publicly. Otniel's family received his body in La Esperanza and buried him there, in the community that had produced him, in the ground he had grown up on, in the same state that had called his death an acceptable byproduct of something more important. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cartel logic that sends armed men into a hospital to finish off an enemy extends beyond Culiacan and beyond private clinics. The final case on this list moves to Guanajuato, where the war between rival criminal organizations has made that state the deadliest in Mexico for years running, and where 2 volunteer paramedics were shot dead inside their ambulance and burned. One of 3 ambulances targeted the same afternoon in an attack that made clear the vehicles that carry the wounded had themselves become weapons in the war. Section 10. Victor y Jesus. Paramedics, Celaya, Guanajuato. Guanajuato is not a state that appears on most people's mental map of Mexico's cartel violence when they first start learning about the drug war. The names that come to mind are Sinaloa, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Michoacán, the states that generated the biggest headlines during the worst years of the violence surge that began in 2006. Guanajuato is an industrial state, home to car factories and manufacturing plants, a place that for many years maintained a level of stability that other regions could not. That stability ended. By 2019, Guanajuato had become the deadliest state in Mexico by absolute number of homicides, a position it held year after year as the body counts climbed. By 2024, Guanajuato accounted for more than 10% of every reported homicide in the entire country, with an average of more than 8 murders per day within its borders. The state that had attracted multinational investment and factory construction now absorbed more violent deaths annually than any other state in the nation. The engine driving this violence is a war that has no sign of ending. The Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, built in the years around 2010 under the leadership of José Antonio Yepes Ortiz, known as El Marro, carved out territory in the agricultural and industrial zones of central Guanajuato through fuel theft, kidnapping, and drug trafficking. El Marro's arrest in 2020 weakened but did not destroy the organization, and the power vacuum his removal created was immediately contested by the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which had been expanding aggressively across Mexico for years and identified Guanajuato's strategic position between Mexico City, the northern border, and the Pacific coast as territory worth fighting for. The result was a grinding, multi-year war between the remnants of the Santa Rosa organization and the forces of the Jalisco cartel, a conflict in which both sides demonstrated a willingness to kill police officers, politicians, civilians, firefighters, and anyone else who occupied the wrong territory at the wrong moment. Celaya, a city of roughly 500,000 people in the south-central part of Guanajuato, became one of the war's worst killing fields. In several recent years, More police officers were shot to death in Celaya than in any comparable city anywhere in the hemisphere. Gunmen attacked bars, restaurants, rehabilitation centers for people with addictions, pre-Christmas parties, people watching baseball games, and taxi stands. The violence did not distinguish between categories of victim with any care. What mattered to the groups perpetrating it was sending a message, controlling territory, and eliminating anything and anyone associated with the rival faction. By 2022, intelligence reports obtained by journalists and later confirmed in leaked military documents known as the Guacamaya leaks had established that both cartels had been using private medical facilities in Celaya to treat their wounded fighters. A clinic called San Fermin had been specifically identified in those documents as a facility linked to the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, used to treat injured cartel members outside the public hospital system where a gunshot wound would trigger police notification. Guanajuato state authorities claimed they had shut down San Fermin in 2021 for failing to meet health standards, though cartel-linked media monitoring suggested its shutdown was related to the Jalisco cartel killing 2 men inside the facility that same November, in exactly the kind of hospital execution that had become a standard tactic in the war. Whatever the formal reason for the closure, the pattern it represented was not interrupted. The cartels continued to fund and use private clinics and private ambulance services to move their wounded, treat their fighters, and maintain the medical infrastructure their operations required. The governor of Guanajuato, Diego Sinjue Rodriguez Vallejo, would describe this openly the day after the events of April 22, 2024, when he confirmed to reporters that the cartel groups operating in the state financed private clinics to attend to their wounded, and that along with those clinics, they also operated associated ambulance services. This was not a new revelation. It was an acknowledgement of something that journalists, medical workers, and security analysts had been documenting in Guanajuato for years. A system in which the infrastructure of emergency medicine, the vehicles, the personnel, the communications equipment, had been absorbed into the logistics chain of criminal organizations that depended on it to keep their fighters operational. It was in this context that 2 volunteer paramedics, known in the public record only as Victor and Jesus, set out in a private ambulance in the late afternoon of Monday, April 22, 2024. Their vehicle, a private ambulance service identified by the company abbreviation SMB and registered with the plate GD 11550B, was moving through the western part of Celaya at around 5:30 in the afternoon when it was intercepted between the neighborhoods of Girasoles and Valle del Real on the street called Esperanza beside the Parroquia de la Santísima Trinidad Church. Armed men traveling on a motorcycle pulled up alongside the ambulance or in front of it and opened fire. Both Victor and Jesus were shot dead inside the vehicle. The attackers then set the ambulance on fire, with the bodies of both men still inside. Firefighters arrived and extinguished the flames. The 2 paramedics were found dead within the burned-out vehicle once the fire was out. According to the account published in El Universal and confirmed by multiple additional sources, including La Jornada and the El País correspondent in Mexico, the paramedics had initially responded to a call for an emergency at the location. Reports indicated that there had been a prior shooting in the area and that Victor and Jesus had gone to the scene to attend to the people who had been hit. Whether they were on their way to that scene, at it, or leaving it when they were intercepted is not entirely resolved in the available reporting. What is clear is that their vehicle was identified and targeted by the armed men on the motorcycle, and that the attack on their ambulance was not a random encounter between their vehicle and someone who did not know what they were shooting at. Approximately a kilometer away from where Victor and Jesus were killed, in the adjacent neighborhood of Alamos, near the Celaya delegation of the Red Cross, a second attack occurred minutes later. 2 more ambulances belonging to the same private service company were found burning, set on fire while parked on a closed street called Flor de Primavera. Those 2 vehicles were empty at the time, and no additional deaths occurred in this second attack. But the near-simultaneous targeting of 3 vehicles from the same private ambulance service in 2 different parts of the city made clear that the attack had been coordinated in advance and that the target was the entire fleet of that particular private service, not just the 1 vehicle that happened to be moving. The Guanajuato governor's public statement, delivered at a press conference the day after the killings, did not offer condolences as its centerpiece. Instead, Diego Sinhue said directly and publicly that the ambulances that had been attacked and burned were linked to a criminal organization. He said the same was true of the paramedics who had been killed. He described a system in which organized crime groups financed private clinics and ambulance services in Celaya specifically to provide medical care to their fighters, and he referenced the San Fermin clinic as an example of how this worked, noting that Guanajuato health authorities had been shutting down such facilities when discovered. He said that on this occasion, the attackers had not targeted neutral emergency workers. They had targeted vehicles and people associated with a rival criminal faction. This is the most difficult thing to say clearly about the events of April 22nd, and it needs to be said honestly rather than avoided. The governor's account was not contradicted by any official or journalistic investigation in the days that followed. The Guanajuato State Prosecutor's Office, which announced on May 1st, 9 days after the attack, that it had identified and arrested the group responsible for the killings, confirmed that the investigation had established those arrested were connected to the attack, and stated that investigators were examining whether the same group was connected to other criminal acts in the Colonia Valle del Real and Colonia Alamos areas. The prosecutors did not publicly identify which criminal organization had carried out the attack, and did not publicly name any of the arrested individuals. The statement confirming the arrests included at least 4 people visible in an image shared on official social media, but no further biographical detail was released. Separately, unconfirmed reporting at the time of the incident suggested the targeted ambulance service was associated with the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel, and that the attack had been carried out by the opposing Jalisco cartel faction as part of the ongoing effort to destroy any resource or infrastructure support that the rival organization depended on. Sitting with this honestly means acknowledging that Victor and Jesus, whose surnames were never publicly released and whose lives outside of their role as paramedics are not documented in any accessible reporting, died in a context where the vehicle they were riding in had been identified by an armed criminal group as a resource belonging to or associated with a rival criminal faction. Whether Victor and Jesus were themselves members of a criminal organization, were paid employees of a clinic or ambulance service that had cartel connections, were volunteers who had agreed to work for such a service without full knowledge of its affiliations, or were simply people doing emergency medical work who happened to work for the wrong employer in the wrong city, none of that is established in the public record. The governor's statement attributed criminal connections to the vehicles and to the victims in a single sentence, but the evidence underlying that attribution was never laid out in a public proceeding that would allow the specifics to be examined. What can be said with confidence is that 2 people whose names were Victor and Jesus went out in an ambulance in Celaya, Guanajuato, on a Monday afternoon in April 2024, and that men on a motorcycle shot them to death and then set their bodies on fire in the vehicle they had been riding in, while 2 more vehicles from the same service burned simultaneously a kilometer away. That the state of Guanajuato, which had more than 2,100 homicides in 2024 alone, recorded these 2 deaths among thousands of others that year, and that the armed group responsible was arrested within 9 days, represents one of the faster clearances in this entire list. That no public prosecution details emerged from those arrests in the months of available reporting is its own commentary on how the legal system processed cartel violence in a state where more than 8 people were dying every single day. The attack on the ambulances in Celaya sits at the end of a list that began with 3 doctors found in concrete-filled steel drums on a highway in 1997, and every case between those 2 endpoints describes a different version of the same basic reality, that organized criminal violence in Mexico does not recognize the exemption from harm that medical workers have represented in every civilized conflict and every functioning society throughout history. Whether a doctor was coerced into performing surgery on a cartel leader who then died on the table, or a radiologist was shot at a checkpoint because she accelerated her car instead of stopping, or a medical intern was killed in his clinic by a drug-intoxicated man connected to a Sierra cartel cell, or a Cuban doctor on a night shift was shot in the head because 2 armed men couldn't find the woman they were looking for, the logic was always the same. The cartel needed something. The cartel took it, and whoever happened to be standing in the space between the cartel and what it needed absorbed the consequence. The pattern documented in these 10 cases is not a series of isolated incidents. Taken together, they form a map of how organized criminal violence in Mexico has used the medical community as a resource when it needed one, and as a target when it felt threatened, and as irrelevant collateral when it was pursuing something else entirely. Doctors who went to work in the Sierra because the government sent them there. Doctors who built careers in cities where cartel factions fought over every block. Paramedics who drove ambulances in a state that had become the most violent in the country. None of them chose to be in proximity to cartel violence. All of them ended up there anyway, because cartel violence in Mexico has no boundary that stops it at the edge of a hospital parking lot, or the door of a consultation room, or the side of an ambulance that says emergency on it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.